Belle R. and Joseph H. Braun Memorial Distinguished Lecture, The Trouble with Principle, Hate Speech in Liberal Proceduralism. This is another event in our celebration of our centennial, so ably organized by my colleague, Professor Ralph Rubner. My name is Professor Polelli. I'm the chair of the executive committee of the faculty, and I've been asked by Dean Johnston, who was suddenly called away, to welcome you all and to convey his greetings to you all for attending today. I also wish to recognize Louis Bureau in the front row. Lou, could you raise your hand, please? He's been president of this school for more than 30 years and is really part of the original John Marshall family. He has been extremely supportive of these programs that we have initiated in honor of our centennial. Though he would never take the credit, he has been a consistent supporter of the faculty in its march towards excellence and new opportunities at the dawn of the 21st century. Joseph H. Braun graduated John Marshall in 1918. He died in 1989. And he endowed this annual lecture series, which bears his name and that of his wife, Belle R. Braun. He devoted most of his legal career to legislative issues, and he was the general counsel, vice president, director, and corporate secretary of the AAA in Chicago. His career, which we honor today, was marked by the highest standards of professionalism and integrity. Our speaker today is Dean Stanley Fish of the University of Illinois at Chicago, the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. He joins a distinguished company of prior speakers. Our past lecturers have included Simon Davies, a nationally acclaimed expert on privacy, the Honorable William H. Webster, former federal judge and former director of the FBI, Professor Derek A. Bell, first tenured African-American professor at Harvard Law School, Clifton R. Wharton, former chairman and CEO of the Teachers Insurance and Annuity Association and the College Retirement Fund, which is very important because that ensures our pensions as professors. We have also had, as a speaker, Elena Bonner, physician, author, and world-renowned human rights advocate, as well as John R. MacArthur, president and publisher of Harper's Magazine. I now turn the proceedings over to my colleague, Professor Donald Beschley, who is the moderator and will introduce our speaker for today. Don?
As you've heard and probably know beforehand, John Marshall is celebrating its 100th birthday this year. Now, I've only been here for a small percentage of that time, but I think I can safely say that today is the first time a noted Milton scholar has delivered a principal address at the John Marshall Law School. But then again, Stanley Fish is not your average Milton scholar. After receiving his PhD in English literature from Yale, he taught at Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, and Duke universities. At Duke, he was chairman of the English department and director of the Duke University Press. His interest in the use and power of language, though, has led him far beyond narrowly conceived departmental boundaries. At Duke, he also held an appointment to the faculty of the law school, and he taught legal theory, jurisprudence, and contracts at Duke. He's certainly the only person I know of who has written both on Paradise Lost and the parole evidence rule. I don't think he's going to talk about parole evidence today, though. He's also become what I guess a prior generation, or perhaps today would be called a public intellectual, a nationally recognized commentator on social and legal issues. His books, which include Is There a Text in This Class?, The Authority of Interpretive Communities, and There's No Such Thing as Free Speech, and It's a Good Thing, Too, have made him one of the most frequently cited non-lawyers in all of legal literature. At the end of last year, in a move which was widely reported not only in places like the Chronicle of Higher Education, but also in the general press. UIC lured Professor Fish away from Duke to become Dean Fish, and he's now Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences over at UIC. A theme that runs through Dean Fish's law-related work is his skepticism of the use of abstract categories or concepts such as fairness, merit, free speech, to cut off debate on issues, and his insistence that those issues be addressed in a pragmatic way, conscious of history and contemporary social realities. And no doubt this theme will appear prominently in his lecture today, which is entitled The Trouble with Principle, Hate Speech, and Liberal Proceduralism. So, without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Dean Stanley Fish.
Thank you very much, and happy birthday. 100 years, and a great 100 years it has been, and I'm extremely pleased and honored to be here and to address you on this occasion. Don is exactly right in his anticipation of what I might say, although I hope I might provide a few surprises, even for those in the audience, and I see that several of you are here, who have heard other installments in this long saga, which I entitle Fish Against Liberalism. The body count or the win-loss count will have to be provided by others. I would, of course, be a biased judge, and of course, that too is all right with me. One of the joys of teaching First Amendment law, as I have been doing for some years now, is that in the event that you leave your casebook at home, all you need do is pick up your morning newspaper and you will find many stories that touch on the First Amendment. And although this is a painful subject and one that no one should make light of or even take advantage of, I should say that the recent events in Littleton, Colorado, have already surfaced at least 4, and there probably are more by now, First Amendment issues. That is, issues that I have seen either discussed on TV, talk show programs, or reported in the newspaper. One has to do with the fact, as you know, that during the event, one of the young persons hiding in a room had a cell phone and contacted a local TV station for help, and that station then put on the air the unfolding events, and some think by doing so endangered the young men and women still in the building being stalked by 2 of their colleagues. The second First Amendment issue that has strongly arisen is the issue related to the website that these young men and some others, it is thought, made up, and its relationship to other websites which identified members of various groups together and bound them together in a fellowship of, it would seem, alienation and hate. This was raised not only in newspaper articles that I have read, but by Tipper Gore, Vice President Gore's wife, last evening on the Larry King Show. Still another issue has to do with the music that has been thought to be in some way a binding force again between people who have thoughts like the thoughts that animated the 2 young men. And finally, in the Chicago Sun-Times this morning, there was a piece on dress codes, also a First Amendment issue, because the argument against dress codes is always an argument for free expression. We are free to express ourselves. Dress is one of the forms of expression. The response to that might be, if dress is a form of expression and what is being expressed is both hateful and dangerous, then how does one counterbalance that value, the freedom of expression through dress, against the value of the harms that might be at least indirectly caused by those forms of dress? I'm not going to settle all of those questions today, but I just wanted to alert you to the relationship between what I will be saying, which will be largely devoted to a case of over 20 years ago, and what is now being said in every part of the country because of the tragedy that has occurred in Colorado. Now, I want to talk today, among other things, about procedural justice, the notion of procedural justice. And I mean by that what almost everyone else who uses the phrase means. That is, justice which in its unfolding is neutral between competing moralities or lifestyles or visions of the good. In a system of procedural justice, we are told by those who are its proponents, the fact that you are a man or a woman, rich or poor, black or white, straight or gay, Democrat or Republican, theist or atheist, will be or should be irrelevant to the determination of whether your rights have been abridged or whether you have committed a crime. It follows then that rights themselves, in a vision of procedural justice, are defined independently of a number of variables. You have those rights no matter who you are or what you happen to believe or what your ethnic tradition. And crimes that you might or might not commit are defined in relation to rules that are general in the sense of not being hostage to a particular or contestable point of view. Rules like thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not bear false witness. Again, in this vision of procedural justice, which, by the way, is very compelling. Every time I rehearse it, on my way to attacking it, I fall under its sway. And I begin to think on page 1, how is it that I'm going to get to what I say in a few pages in criticism of this point of view? So according to a vision of procedural justice, we do not say you have rights to property legally acquired if you are a Christian and a man. Rather, we say you have rights to property legally acquired, period. Nor do we say thou shalt not kill except if you kill a nigger or an Indian or a queer. We say thou shalt not kill, period. Now, of course, the very examples I have used alert us to the unhappy fact that in our own history, procedural justice has sometimes been contaminated by the very value judgments it supposedly brackets. There was a time, and it was a long time, when women did not enjoy the free use of their property, in part because they were considered by those who made the laws, that is, by men, not fully capable of ordering their affairs. And there was also a time, within my living memory and within the memory of some of you, when crimes against African Americans were either condoned or ignored. And many Americans today do not need controversies about gays in the military to remind them that in some states in the nation, homosexuals are even now regarded by the law as either criminals or as potential criminals, should they decide to translate their sexual orientation into action. Now, these examples of periods in our history where the goal or vision of procedural justice has in fact not been lived up to, do not necessarily embarrass the champions of procedural justice, who will acknowledge the mistakes that have been made along the way, but will insist that however distressing some aspects of our past performance may be, we are, as Americans, nevertheless going in the right direction, as the law, in Ronald Dworkin's words, quote, continues to work itself pure. Whereby pure, I think Dworkin means toward the goal of procedural purity, a purity unadulterated by substantive bias, a law that is truly blind, colorblind, gender blind, race blind, ideology blind, sexual orientation blind, and all the rest. Now, one place where this goal seems at least to have been approximated is in First Amendment jurisprudence, where we are told, after many false starts, First Amendment jurisprudence has arrived finally in the late half of the 20th century at what the framers meant when they said that Congress shall make no law abridging freedom of speech. They meant that all forms of speech, like all colors or genders or races, are to be tolerated indifferently no matter what their content. Perhaps the strongest formulation of this mature understanding of the First Amendment is a pronouncement by retired Justice Powell in a 1974 case called Gertz versus Robert Welsh. In that case, Powell says, "Under the First Amendment, there is no such thing as a false idea." And he goes on to say, "However pernicious an opinion may seem, we depend for the correction of that opinion not on the conscience of judges, but on the competition of other ideas in the marketplace of ideas," unquote. Now, the word seem in Powell's second sentence, "however pernicious an opinion may seem," is the key to his logic. An idea may seem pernicious, even to persons in high positions, but the First Amendment prohibits us from making such judgments, which must be left to time and to the marketplace. Thus interpreted by Powell and other justices, the First Amendment is an exemplary instance of procedural justice. Why? Because it identifies an activity, speech or expression, in minimally physical terms, that is, in terms of opening up your mouth and producing sound, and not in terms of what the sound's meaning is, and then without reference to substantive determination, it puts the majesty of the law squarely behind the right of anyone saying anything to engage in that activity, that is, the activity of expression. In what follows, I shall be asking two related questions. Is this a possible thing to do? Can one, in fact, devise a procedural mechanism that is in no way hostage to judgments of substance? And second, is it a good thing to do if you could do it? My answer to both questions will be no. And I propose to begin developing that answer by examining a sentence from a recent book on the First Amendment. The book, and you have the quotation on the sheet that I have passed out to you, or rather that someone else has passed out to you at my direction. The book is called Free Speech in an Open Society. Its author is Rodney Smolla, a well-known chaired professor of law at the College of William and Mary, an excellent law school. Here is Professor Smolla's sentence, and I want you to listen to it even as I read it. "A professor should have the right to espouse bona fide academic opinions concerning racial characteristics or capabilities, even though most people of goodwill and good sense on the campus would find the opinions loathsome." Now, you all read that? Let me try it once more. I want you to get the flavor of it. A professor should have the right to espouse bona fide academic opinions concerning racial characteristics or capabilities, even though most people of goodwill and good sense on the campus would find the opinions loathsome. I submit to you that there's a trouble spot in this sentence, a place where its logic goes a little awry. What is that trouble spot? Louder. Bona fide. I don't know to how many audiences, informal and formal, I have presented that sentence, but the response to my question is always the same. Bona fide sits awkwardly in the sentence. And so I report, every time I read this sentence, I am moved to ask, as I ask you, what does Professor Smolla mean by bona fide? Or, to be slightly more severe, what could he possibly mean by it? The problem is not the phrase itself, which bears the perfectly ordinary meaning we all know of authentic or genuine. The problem is the opposition established in the sentence between the judgment of value inherent in bona fide, that's the only way we usually use the phrase, to positively judge the values of something, and the collective judgments of most people of goodwill and good sense on the campus. How can something be bona fide if it's not been judged so by most people of goodwill and good sense? What does bona fide mean? If such persons, that is, people of goodwill and good sense, are joined in their rejection of the opinion in question, in what sense are those opinions bona fide? There are two possible, what is the content then of bona fide in Professor Smolla's mind? There are two possible answers to this question. Neither of them, I think, will be very helpful or comforting. On the one hand, bona fide may be a purely formal requirement that has no content whatsoever, in which case a bona fide academic opinion would be any opinion that came out of the mouth of someone who had a degree or an appointment in a department. Right? Well, think about it. Or in an alternative internal formalistic reading of bona fide, one that goes inside a person's psychology to determine bona fideness, the good faith sense of bona fide might be emphasized. And then you would say that a professor could freely say anything. For example, the trouble with the Holocaust is that it didn't kill more Jews, so long as he sincerely believed it. Then he would be bona fide. Now, these two formalist readings of bona fide, one external and one internal, do square with the sentence's separation of bona fide on the one hand from the properties of goodwill and good sense on the other. But if you went in that route, it would imply an oddly impoverished notion of what it means to be an academic, and one that certainly would not be ratified by deans, provosts, and tenure committees for whom good sense, as defined by the prevailing norms in a discipline, is a bottom line criterion. I mean, suppose in some tenure meeting that you were all a party to, the defender of the candidate says, yeah, I know his ideas are bizarre and he hasn't done very much research, and actually it's a little bit crazy, and a lot of people hate it, and it probably will do some damage, but he went to Yale. Or, but he really believes it. Let's promote him. Sure. Now, what's the alternative to these, as I have labeled them, formalist readings of bona fide? The alternative is to read bona fide as if it had a content, as if it marked a distinction between the legitimate and the illegitimate, between opinions worth paying attention to and opinions that are not. This would have the advantage of putting some life into the phrase. Bona fide would now have some substantive bite, but at the expense of the disjunction between academic freedom and good sense that makes the assertion of freedom as strong as Smala apparently wants it to be. He can't put any substance into the phrase bona fide and still make his point. He is thus in a perfect bind. Either he fully means something by bona fide, in which case professors are constrained in what they are able to say, in some sense yet to be defined, or bona fide is without its usual honorific significance and will be the imputed property of anything said by a professor. This bind, however, is not of Smala's making. Smala is a very smart man. So part of my question is, how did he get to write such a dumb sentence? This bind is not of his making, but is given to him by a view of the First Amendment in which what the amendment protects is the production of noise, because it is indifferent to what the noise means or to whether or not it means anything. In the context of that view, it is hard to make coherent sense, since coherence and sense have been dispensed with as criteria of judgment in the sentence. The result is the embarrassment of a phrase like bona fide, which is, in Smala's sentence, a vestigial survivor of a value system that he is in the process of abandoning. That is, he is saying, let's not pay attention to the substantive content of what is said, let's just be formally procedural, but then he sticks in the word bona fide, which is hard to understand unless it has reference to some substantive judgment. This, I think, is a nice example of what the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre means when he talks about, quote, the shards or scraps of a moral vocabulary that no longer has a point of reference in relation to which it might be intelligible. A literary analog, and of course I couldn't resist this, would be the inability of the fallen angels in Milton's Paradise Lost to produce sentences that do not fall apart in their mouths, much the way Smala's sentence falls apart. You may recall that having severed their connection with the only source of value in the universe by rebelling against God, Milton's fallen angels are reduced to saying things like this, and this is a sentence uttered by Satan, quote, "We are surer to prosper than prosperity could have assured us." I'll give you that one again. "We are surer to prosper than prosperity could have assured us." Now, one would be as hard put to assign a meaning to sure or prosperity in Satan's utterance as we are to assign a meaning to bona fide in Smola's. Smola, however, I hasten to assure you, is not Satan. He's just a liberal. And as a liberal, he does not want to really abandon the perspective of morality, even though his sentence requires it. He merely wants to remove it from the precincts of First Amendment determinations. Indeed, when Smola insists that possibly racist opinions of professors must be tolerated in the name of academic freedom, he goes out of his way to assure us, this is the way the First Amendment game is played, that he does not tolerate them personally. And he would no doubt include himself on the side of those on the campus with goodwill and good sense. Who of us would not? In another paragraph of this same book, Smola states unequivocally that, quote, hate speech should be fought by all citizens of goodwill because it is an abomination and because the elimination of racism is itself enshrined in our Constitution. If so, it took a long time to realize it, as a public value of the highest order. Indeed, if he, Smola, were asked, I am sure that he would see no contradiction between these strong expressions of anti-racism value and his extension of First Amendment protection to racist views. Rather, he would see their conjunction. Yes, I am against racism, but I do not want to suppress racist views. He would see that conjunction as evidence of the strength of his First Amendment position, which commits him to the defense of speech acts that he despises personally. The stance is a familiar one, whether it derives from Voltaire or from the ACLU. And though you remember the ACLU, that curious organization whose mission it is to go out, find things it hates, and then to grow them. This is extremely curious. The stance is a familiar one, whether it derives from Voltaire or the ACLU. And those who strike that stance often imagine themselves as First Amendment heroes, bravely rising above their mere preferences, prejudices, and substantive opinions in order to stand up for a principle. That principle is that under the Constitution there is no such thing as a false idea, and therefore ideas are to be let into the public air indiscriminately. The problem is that everyone, including the strong defenders of that very principle, discriminates between ideas all the time. And not because of a failure to live up to a principle, but because the formulation of expression, saying things, speech, is itself inherently a discriminatory activity. You only say something against the background of things you could have said and chose to suppress, and you only say things in order to fill the air and therefore prevent others who would say opposing things to fill the air. The fact that a phrase like bona fide finds its way into Smola's disavowal of value judgments, even though it is itself fraught with a value judgment, does not mean that he should have removed the word or phrase and cleaned his sentence up. It means that he couldn't have cleaned his sentence up because neither he nor anyone else could write a sentence or have a thought purged of the discriminatory, judgmental impulses that he would have us bracket or suppress. Someone like Smola is laboring under an impossible and self-imposed requirement. He must continue to be full of the values that make him who and what he is, that is, an anti-racist. He must continue, in short, to be a person of substance, and yet at the same time, he must enact, according to his own mind, the supposedly higher value of setting his substantive values aside in the name of a procedural purity. The resulting strain, which in this sentence amounts to schizophrenia, produces the awkwardness of bona fide. Now, the awkwardness of bona fide in a sentence by a law professor, even a distinguished law professor, is an interesting observation, but not one of consequence. But when the same pattern of thought is revealed in the opinions of appellate and Supreme Court justices, it becomes consequential indeed, where it takes the form of what I will call, in this essay, the rhetoric of regret. Now, you know you are hearing the rhetoric of regret when a judge tells you, usually about some form of speech that has wounded someone, when a judge tells you that he hates the activity he is about to allow, has only contempt for those who are engaging in it, and profound sympathy for those who are its victims. Again, in reference to speech, this judge will say, this stuff is really terrible, or pornography. The people trafficking in it are really awful, and you are their innocent victims, but nevertheless. This is the sound of regret being performed by judges, and never has the performance been so elaborate or heartfelt as in the case of Colin versus Smith, the Skokie case, about which I probably needn't tell this audience very much. The facts of the case are well known. As part of a campaign of provocation in the 1970s, a neo-Nazi group called the Nationalist Socialist Party of America, led by one Frank Colin, announced its intention to demonstrate in the village of Skokie, Illinois, which was the home, not incidentally, that is why it was chosen, of many survivors of the Holocaust. The purpose of the demonstration was clear and announced. Colin spoke of using the First Amendment, quote, against the Jew, unquote. That is, he counted on provoking a response from the Holocaust survivors that would allow him to portray himself as a First Amendment hero. I planned the reaction of the Jews, he boasted, and one of his followers was even more forthright. Quote, I hope they're terrified. I hope they're shocked, because we're coming to get them again. I don't care if someone's mother or brother died in the gas chambers. The unfortunate thing is not that there were 6 million Jews who died. The unfortunate thing is that there were so many Jewish survivors, unquote. Not surprisingly, statements like this one, reported in the Chicago Sun-Times, produced the desired reaction. And the village elders passed several ordinances, including an insurance requirement that the organization would have been unable to meet, ordinances designed to block the demonstration. Their efforts failed when 2 members of a 3-judge panel held their ordinances unconstitutional under the First Amendment, saying, among other things, that it was the business of the court, quote, to protect the activity in which the appellees wished to engage, not to render moral judgment, either on their views or on their tactics, unquote. That is to say, the court declares itself to be neutral with respect to moral questions because the citation is inevitable and does occur in the opinion, quote, under the First Amendment, there is no such thing as a false idea. Like Smala, however, the majority judges know a false idea when they see one. And again, like Smala, they want to assure the world that they are on the right side, even though they are about to allow the speech of the wrong side to flourish. Hence the rhetoric of regret, which begins in the second sentence of the opinion's first sections, right after the recital of the facts. Regret comes fast in this opinion, and you have 3 statements of it. I read the first. We would hopefully surprise no one by confessing personal views, hopefully is a grammatical error, by confessing personal views that NSPA's beliefs and goals are repugnant to the core values held generally by residents of this country, and indeed to much of what we cherish in civilization. As judges sworn to defend the Constitution, however, we cannot decide this or any other case on that basis, i.e., on the basis of values and of civilization. This is beginning to sound very curious. Ideological tyranny, no matter how worthy its motivation, is forbidden as much to appointed judges as to elected legislatures. I find this an amazing sequence. It begins with Judge Pell speaking for himself and his fellow in the majority, there was a dissenter, announcing his personal morality, which he assures us is wholly opposed to the morality of the neo-Nazi organization. The word personal is not casually used. It contains a familiar First Amendment argument. Each of us has his or her strong views, but we should be wary of imposing those views on others as if they were everyone's. But as the sentence unfolds, it turns out that in this instance at least, Pell's views are by his own account, everyone's. They are not strictly speaking personal at all, for they correspond, as he says, or as he claims, to the core values held generally by residents of this country. Now, core values, as you know, are values that sustain an enterprise. In this case, what they sustain, according to Pell, is the enterprise of democracy. In the next part of his sentence, the ante is upped even higher when the enterprise is re-identified as civilization itself and all we cherish in it. If civilization itself and all we cherish in it is what is endangered by the neo-Nazis' organization's beliefs and goals, it becomes somewhat hard to see the rationale for tolerating the organization's activities. For, as a lower court acknowledged in passing, quote, if any philosophy should be regarded as completely unacceptable to civilized society, that of the plaintiffs who have deliberately identified themselves with a regime whose record of brutality and barbarism is unmatched would be a good place to start, unquote. But Pell declines to start there because he says to do so would be to commit ideological tyranny, which is forbidden no matter how worthy its motivation. I was again quoting from his paragraph. Now, the word worthy here is like bona fide in smaller sentence. It belongs to a vocabulary of moral judgment that is being discounted or abandoned in this paragraph. And like bona fide, worthy produces a puzzle. How can something worthy in its motivation be characterized as ideological tyranny? Now, one knows what Pell means. He means that the desire to prevent further harm to those who have already suffered extraordinary physical and psychological pain is a worthy one. But in order to realize that worthy desire, we would have to suppress a viewpoint, and that is ideological tyranny. Now, this makes a certain kind of sense until you remember that the viewpoint you are wary of repressing is the very type of tyranny and is, according to Pell, I'm not making this claim, universally recognized as such. It is only by taking the content out of tyranny and making tyranny into an epistemological crime, not a crime you commit against Jews or Ukrainians or gypsies, but a crime you commit against Immanuel Kant. It's only when you make it that kind of crime that tyranny can be equated with the protection of defenseless old men and old women. Now, one might object, and the objection would, I think, have more than a little point, that this is a melodramatic characterization of the situation. After all, it is only words and placards, billboards, slogans that the Holocaust survivors would face if the march were allowed to go on. And as we know, sticks and stones may break our bones, but to its credit, however, the Pell Court does not pursue this line of argument. Instead, it acknowledges that, quote, the proposed demonstration, if it were allowed, would seriously disturb emotionally and mentally at least some, and probably many, of the village of Skokie's residents, unquote. The acknowledgement is significant because it takes note of what many First Amendment arguments failed to recognize, the harms produced by some forms of speech. But these harms are finally not taken seriously, even after they have been flagged, and serve only to heighten the rhetoric of regret. I read to you the next statement, rather the one that begins, "We feel compelled." We feel compelled once again to express our repugnance at the doctrine which the appellees desire to profess publicly. Indeed, it is a source of extreme regret that after several thousand years of attempting to strengthen the often thin coating of civilization with which humankind has attempted to hide brutal animal-like instincts, there would still be those who would resort to hatred and vilification of fellow human beings because of their racial backgrounds or their religious beliefs, or for that matter, any reason at all. Here again we have the reference to civilization, but with an added and I think interesting phrase, thin coating of, because that points up again the oddness of the court's logic even as that logic unfolds. If civilization is in fact only a thin coating, then why is it the obligation of civilization's chief officers members of the high judiciary, to protect an activity whose professed aim and historically achieved intention is to wear that thin coating away, and thereby perhaps release the brutal animal-like instincts it holds down. This paragraph from the opinion tells a powerful, even dramatic story of values, civilization's values under siege. But the tellers of the story decline to come to the defense of the values they so obviously cherish. What holds them back? The short answer to the question, and it could be a very long answer, is the demands of procedural justice, which require, as you recall, that the state neither favor nor disfavor any particular conception of the good life. Nazism is such a conception, and no matter how distasteful it might be to Judge Pell or to you or to me, we must be wary of institutionalizing our own views in the form of laws or judicial decisions. That's the logic of procedural justice once again. But the logic loses some of its persuasiveness when it comes packaged as it comes packaged here in the rhetoric of regret. A procedural view of the First Amendment is appealing only if you assume that speech-induced harms, unlike the harms caused by physical assault, are relatively minor, barely skin-deep, mere inconveniences for which a remedy is available in the form of counter-speech, Justice Brandeis. The remedy for harmful speech is more speech. But that assumption cannot be squared with the rhetoric of regret, for the court here is not saying, gee, it's too bad that we have to endure the experience of being subjected to such burst sentiments, but our way of life is strong enough to survive them, and will in fact be stronger if we tolerate them. That's not what this court is saying, although some have said that. Rather, the court is saying that our way of life is a fragile achievement, no stronger than the thin coating that covers brutal instinct, and what's more, it identifies the neo-Nazi organization's doctrine as an expression of a barbarity we have barely escaped, only in this case less than 30 years ago. The court's regret, in short, is deep and reflects deep fears which strain against the confidence that underlies its statements of procedural justice. The confidence that by refusing to engage in value judgments, the state will assure the flourishing of values, or at least of the values that it most prizes. It is not, however, so easy, even for members of the Pell majority, to detach yourself from your conviction. For as we have seen, they well up even in sentences from which they have supposedly been purged. Here is the concluding sentence of the majority opinion. You don't have it on your sheet, but it is short. The result that we have reached is dictated by the fundamental proposition that if these civil rights are to remain vital for all, they must protect not only those society deems acceptable, but also those whose ideas it quite justifiably rejects and despises. Pell's intention here is to reinstate and rehearse for the last time the fundamental tenet of procedural justice. The protection of individual rights must not vary with the ideological commitments of particular citizens, even judges. Rights are to be extended to everyone, not merely to those whose views society happens to approve. Deems acceptable strikes just the right skeptical note, for what is deemed acceptable today may not be so deemed tomorrow, when a view currently despised will have replaced what is now currently acceptable. This note, however, is not sustained, because when it comes time to relativize today's hated viewpoint, Nazism, Pell cannot bring himself to do it. And instead of saying of Nazism that it is presently despised, he says, quote, it is quite justifiably despised, where quite justifiably is not a qualified judgment, but means just plain justified. Now, then, always. Quite justifiably, at the end of this opinion, is like bona fide in smaller sentence. It gives the lie to the assertion of content neutrality and acknowledges a perspective of certainty and judgment that has supposedly been repudiated in the opinion. Here one might object that my account of these matters is perverse. Indeed it is, because it leaves out the essential point, which is when First Amendment advocates like Smoller and Pell discount their personal values, they do so in the name of a higher value, whose flourishing requires their act of self-abnegation. Now, what is this higher value? Well, that question has often been answered and been disputed. But Pell's account of it, which he takes from a case called Police Department of Chicago versus Mosley, is fairly representative. Pell says, and you don't have this on the sheet, we must allow the expression of all speech, no matter what its content, in order to facilitate the continual building of our politics and our culture, and also to assure self-fulfillment for each individual. This statement imagines democracy as an experiment always in progress, and asserts that the health of the process depends on not closing off any of the pathways it might want to explore, even if they seem to us pathways that are dark and forbidding, at least at the moment. Moreover, Pell's statement implies keeping the flow of information open is important not only to the growth of the culture, but to the growth of its individual members, whose development requires a ready supply of contending viewpoints from which to pick and choose. Like the political culture one inhabits, the individual is himself or herself in process, and like the political culture, must be protected from his or her own tendency to assume that the opinions now held are the right ones. He or she must experience the frustration of a present desire, the desire to see one's opinions enacted into law, in order to achieve the maturity that awaits us all in a future that will only emerge if we resist the attractions of premature judgment. Now, this account of the benefits to be derived from a strongly procedural view of the First Amendment, self-fulfillment for individuals, the success of the ongoing experiment in democracy. This account of the benefits is coherent and powerful in its own terms, and is essentially the account offered over 350 years ago by, you guessed it, John Milton in his famous prose tract, The Areopagitica. There is, however, one crucial difference. Milton, in a passage that has given his First Amendment admirers fits, announces 3/4 of the way through his tract in praise of toleration that there is one form of doctrine, one idea that he will not tolerate and will not be tolerated in his marketplace. You understand, Milton says, that when I speak of a general toleration, I don't mean Catholics, them we burn. Or, to give you the exact text, I mean not tolerated popery and open superstition, which, as it extirpates all religious and civil supremacies, so itself should be extirpate. Extirpate, by the way, means destroyed, or, my favorite meaning, pulled up by the roots. Now, you might think that there is a contradiction between this discriminatory judgment against Catholics, or Catholic doctrine, he would have extended to Catholics, I assure you, and Milton's tract-long plea for toleration. But in fact, Milton would say, were he called on this point, that the maintenance of toleration, as he understands it, requires this exception to it. Earlier, Milton has told us that the toleration of many opinions is necessary if the waters of truth are to flow in a perpetual progression and not sicken into a muddy pool of conformity and tradition. That guy could write. But conformity and tradition, he has told us, are exactly what is taught and urged by Catholicism. Therefore, to tolerate the propagation of Catholic doctrine would be to endanger the goal of perpetual progression which toleration serves. In order to serve toleration, you must suppress Catholics. No law, Milton points out, can permit an activity that constitutes an assault on itself. No law, he says, quote, that intends not to unlaw itself, unquote. Milton's point, in my view, holds for any law that is purposive. Any law that has a purpose. Any law that has a goal in the form of some hoped-for consequence, whether that goal is the flourishing of the search for truth or the continual building of our culture or the self-fulfillment of the individual. There will always be a form of speech that is subversive of the goal speech is supposed to further. There will always be a form of speech whose effect it is to impede the search for truth, or to frustrate the building of our culture, or to block the self-fulfillment of individuals. And to these speech acts, one will say what Milton says to Catholics. Oh, I didn't mean to tolerate that. And of course, that will differ with each of us. A strongly procedural First Amendment, even when it's announced, will always have a substantive kicker up its sleeve, one that will emerge in crisis. One of the strongest supporters of the First Amendment in a popular and scholarly vein in the last 20 years has been Nat Hentoff, a famous jazz critic who has also become a First Amendment commentator. And Hentoff wrote two very long and powerfully argued books, strongly saying that no form of speech, even forms of speech which he despises, should be in any way suppressed, especially on college campuses, where, of course, forms of speech are what is produced by members of the community. But then when a renegade member of the Farrakhan crew went around campuses calling Jews bagel-eating vermin who had crawled out of the caves of Europe to pollute us all, Hentoff said in print, "I've had enough." Now, what I want to say is that everyone has a point at which you say, "I've had enough," and at that moment, everything that you believed in as a support for the strong First Amendment protection of speech argues that you have to suppress a particular instant of it. Now, the only way out of this corner, the only way for procedural justice to be procedurally, truly procedurally, and not covertly substantive, is for the First Amendment to have no goal or purpose. Remember, I said as long as the First Amendment has a purpose, then you're going to find at some time some form of speech tends to be subversive of that purpose, and you'll want to legislate against that form of speech. But suppose you hold that the First Amendment doesn't have a purpose, which might seem to you to be a curious position, but actually is a mainstream deontological position, as some of you will recognize. It is, however, a position almost no one holds, except a colleague of mine at the Duke Law School, William Van Alstyne, extremely well known and extremely smart. And he writes, and you do have this on page 2, it's a wonderful statement, the last one on page 2. Van Alstyne, or as we call him at the Duke Law School, VA, writes, "The First Amendment does not link the protection it provides with any particular objective and may accordingly be deemed to operate without regard to anyone's view of how well the speech it protects may or may not serve such an objective." That's what I call pure. Or in other words, what Van Alstyne is saying is, ask not what the First Amendment does for you. That's the wrong question. The First Amendment doesn't serve you. You, according to this statement by Van Alstyne, serves it. It is a principle which brooks no interrogation and welcomes no inquiry into the absoluteness of its ways. If you ask the First Amendment to explain itself or provide a pedigree for its authority, it will not answer, saying in effect, "I am what I am." This, of course, as you will already have recognized, is the language of divinity, and it is at least ironic that a militant secularist like Van Alstyne would, in his statement, lay bare the theological claims implicit in a strong First Amendment position. The theological claim is very simple. What strong First Amendment proponents ask you to do in relation to the First Amendment is worship it. That's it. It is your benchmark. You worship it against all other competing values. For if you sunder the First Amendment's operation from the determination of value, then that operation is pointing in no direction except back at itself. It becomes its own value, unaccountable and unassailable. It becomes God. Here then is the choice, at least as I have drawn it. Either a true proceduralism, like Van Alstyne's, that disallows any inquiry into the First Amendment's rationale or its effects, or a Milton-like exercise of substantive judgment, perhaps not against Catholics, but against someone, in which it is determined that the meaning of free speech can only be honored by suppressing an example of it. Now, I prefer the second of these alternatives, not as a preference, but as a statement of what always happens anyway, witness Nat Hentoff. But merely to articulate this view is to provoke two strong objections. The first usually takes the form of a series of familiar questions. Who is to make the determination that a particular kind of speech is subversive of the general values which speech is supposed to support? And will not any such determination reflect preferences, the preferences of some individual or group? Does not that person or group become vulnerable to the same act of suppression should there be a change in the structure of power? These questions point us to the second objection, which is that once substantive considerations are allowed to infect and inflect First Amendment decisions, once you protect or suppress a particular form of speech because you either favor or despise the agenda it urges, you will have no argument of principle against a speech policy motivated by a politics opposed to your own. Suppress Nazi rantings today, we are told. This is, of course, the slippery slope argument, and it will be Shakespeare tomorrow, which is exactly what Judge Pell says at an especially dramatic point. He says, and you do have this ordinance, that is the ordinance designed to prevent the NSPA demonstration, quote, could conceivably be applied to criminalize dissemination of the Merchant of Venice. Now, that's a powerful move. Why is it a powerful move? Because in this culture, if you're not worshiping the First Amendment, you're probably worshiping Shakespeare. Or you witness Shakespeare in love, you're probably worshiping both at the same time. This, by the way, is another stance I dislike, art worship. I don't like art worship. I don't like First Amendment worship. I'm perfectly happy with worship of God, but neither the First Amendment nor Shakespeare are my gods, and this is what we're dealing with here. In fact, when the Merchant of Venice move is made, as it is made by Pell or almost anything else, I have a response that perhaps could only be available without danger of being shot to an English professor. I say, hey, the Merchant of Venice. The guy wrote what? 37 other plays. So we lost the Merchant of Venice. Big deal. You know, have you read The Phoenix and the Turtle lately? I know Clark has, but he doesn't count. At least in this discussion. Okay. But notice when Pell invokes Shakespeare at a crucial point, he plays the usual double game of the First Amendment as I've described it. On one hand, he's saying, look, this is what makes the whole argument work. That is, there's no such thing as a false idea, or from another famous Supreme Court case, one man's vulgarity is another man's lyric. Pell is saying there's no way of distinguishing in principle between neo-Nazi rantings and Shakespeare. But at the same time, his warning, we risk losing the Merchant of Venice, has force only if that distinction between neo-Nazi rantings and Shakespeare is assumed. And it's assumed, too, that everyone recognizes it. My point goes in two directions. First, the slippery slope fear will not be realized because a society that values Shakespeare will act to prevent his disappearance. Slippery, and in fact, it's not the society that values Shakespeare in England and America and elsewhere, although it certainly does. It's the Shakespeare industry that values Shakespeare. That's big time, really big time. Okay. Slippery, in the real world, the slippery slope slide will be retarded by all the in-place investments that a slippery slope argument supposedly suspends. And my second point is even more important. It is Shakespeare or some other already honored and valued discourse that one wishes to protect, and not a principle. Not a principle in relation to which Shakespeare and neo-Nazi rantings are valued indifferently. That is, when we think up something like the First Amendment in its stronger versions, there are lots of sensible versions of the First Amendment that I could sign on to in a minute, like the one articulated by Judge Robert Bork in the 1971 Indiana Law Review article, for which he was lambasted, and in part, although he himself supplied an irritable personality that contributed to his downfall. But still, it was that article and a few others that were used as the weaponry. I don't mind a good First Amendment argument. It's these strong First Amendment arguments that drive me crazy. And what I'm saying is that when you think up a strong First Amendment argument, it's not because you value the thing for itself. It's because you're worried about documents, texts, forms of music, etc., that you like. Moreover, it is the habit, I would contend, of framing everything in terms of principle that make people confused about what they really want and renders them vulnerable to certain argumentative ploys. In recent years, mainstream liberals have been discombobulated when a practice they abhor is defended by invoking some principle which they had themselves invoked 35 years earlier in order to argue for a practice they favored then. And here's the way that questioning goes. How can you, who so vigorously opposed the McCarthyite suppression of Marxists on certain campuses in the 50s and 60s, now urge the suppression of neo-Nazis or anti-Semites or pornographers on those same campuses? Or the question is, by what principle can you be on one side of the free speech question in 1964, and I myself was an instructor at Berkeley at that moment, and on the other side in 1994? Or how can you, who worked for integration in the great civil rights struggles of the 50s and 60s, now condone all black fraternities, or separate dining tables, or schools for young black males in our inner cities? Or how can you, who made Anita Hill a symbol in the fight against sexual harassment, now turn around and refuse to take up the cause of Paula Jones against Bill Clinton? Now, faced with all of these challenges, again, challenges made in terms of principles he or she invoked some years ago, challenges now emerging out of the face of mouths of one's ideological opponents. In the face of such questions and challenges, what's a liberal to do? My answer is simple. Forget about the principle, and therefore stop being a liberal, which was never what you were interested in the first place, and make an argument for the policy on policy grounds, on substantive grounds. That is, on the grounds that you think the policy is good and right. Argue that civil rights supporters were not working for a colorblind society, even though that phrase may have been rhetorically effective, but working rather for better conditions for African Americans. And argue that the achieving of better conditions today might involve practices of voluntary segregation. Argue that in your view, the presence of Marxists on campus is beneficial to education, while the presence of bigots and racists is not. Now, when principle enters this picture, however, it takes over, and no one is able to talk about what is really on his mind. No one is able to identify his substantive values and speak out for them. A good example is the recent, now several years old, cross-burning case in Minneapolis, which, as you'll recall, some teenage youths burned a cross on the lawn of the only black family in the St. Paul, I think, neighborhood. In the course of that case, it was repeatedly said that the plaintiffs, that is, those who protested and wanted the two youths convicted under a hate crime law, it was said repeatedly that the plaintiffs could have won on simple trespass, and therefore that there was no need for a hate crime law. But I submit to you that it was not the trespass on its property by which the black family felt wounded, nor was trespass the crime the cross burners wanted to commit. In other words, if you go under a regime of liberal proceduralism, as I have described it, you necessarily have to disguise both what you believe in and what you object to in the behavior of others. This, I think, is at least a questionable form of thought, and it should be questioned. This is what I mean when I say that what is at stake in First Amendment disputes is almost never a principle, even though it is in the vocabulary of principle that the argument is often conducted. Pornographers, Holocaust deniers, cross burners are not, no matter what they claim, standing up for free speech. They're standing up for pornography, or for the denial of the Holocaust, or for the intimidation of minorities. And on the other, left liberal side, homeless advocates who wish to sleep in federal parks as a form of protest, animal rights activists who heap scorn and perhaps blood on fur-clad women, anti-government protesters who burn American flags. They're not for free speech either. Therefore, housing for the homeless, this is a list I like better, therefore housing for the homeless, for humane treatment of animals, and for a change in at least some U.S. policies. In all of these instances, the fact that free speech arguments migrate easily from one side of the debate to the other, so that one side says, you are subverting the right of free expression, and the other side says, no, you are. This fact is a clear indication that the employment of free speech arguments is a strategy in the service of an agenda that is not identical with and does not follow from any free speech principle. So again, I am saying when it comes to First Amendment disputes, one must look to the substantive, purposeful context and judge whether or not that form of speech, whatever it might be, is in fact inimical to, hostile to, subversive of those values in which you might wish in other contexts to urge the First Amendment. This still leaves me with the question with which I will conclude, the question I have raised before. But who is to judge? By now you should see that this question is simply another form of the strategy by which the everyday context in which judgments are made all the time is replaced by the abstract or principled and substantively empty context in which judgment is by definition always impure. That is, the question who is to judge doesn't imagine a particular situation, but imagines all situations. It's actually the activity that you all engage in, those of you who are either students or professors of law, in the form of hypotheticals. That is, you're always being pushed to some further extreme example of the case before you, and being told that in doing so you are in search of the principle by which this and other cases might be adjudicated. What I am saying is that's a mug's game. You're never going to find that principle, and in your search for it, you will have run away from the actual facts of the case and what is at stake in it for anyone. Who is to judge? Who is to draw the line? These are not serious questions, for those who pose them would be satisfied only if the judge were infallible and if the line could be drawn once and for all. And all the while, as they ask the questions, they know that there are no such judges, and that a line drawn in the context of this situation with these participants will soon have to be drawn again when the situation and the participants change. The questions, in short, are asked with the expectation and hope that they will not be answered. For then those who ask them can throw up their clean hands and say, see, there's no principled way to do this, so let's not go down that road. Well, I'm willing to stipulate to that fact there is no principled way to do this, but let's remember too that the principle upheld in not doing it, in not standing up for substantive justice when speech is productive of harms, is the principle of doing nothing. The principle, as the one dissenting judge in Colon versus Smith put it, of paralysis. Who is to judge? I have an answer to that question. How about the people whose job it is to judge? Judges, administrators, mayors, governors, deans, provosts, college presidents, all of those who, by virtue of the positions they occupy, have been assigned and have accepted the task of making decisions, even when the lines of decision-making are not perfectly clear, and they are, as we all are, less than infallible. Exercising this responsibility is, of course, a risk. And the risk, if it goes badly, may have quite dire consequences. But there are also, I think, consequences to not exercising that responsibility, especially when, as in the Skokie case, there is no acknowledgement of the relative costs and benefits of deciding not to decide, as they decided not to decide. Lee Bollinger is now the president of the University of Michigan. He is also, as many of you will know, a noted First Amendment scholar. And writing on this very case some years ago, he said, "One might have hoped for a full and rich appreciation of the gains to be had by protecting speech of the neo-Nazi kind. One might have hoped for a clear sense of the purpose or purposes behind that concept of free speech. But all we got," Bollinger laments, quote, "is a tight doctrinal, that is procedural analysis," and I am still quoting, "that avoided rather than confronted the social meaning of what was being done in its name." Bollinger then notes, as I have here, without naming it, the presence of the rhetoric of regret. Quote, "When the judges peered out from behind the wall of their doctrine, it was only to plead helplessness through an argument about the inability to draw the distinctions required to decide the case the way they would have decided it personally," unquote. In the end, what the judges said was, "We will not decide because we are not gods." To which I would reply, because none of us is a god, some of us must decide, lest the imperatives of the moral life be given over to forces called the marketplace of ideas that are accountable to no one and bound to no vision except the anti-vision of chance and random fate. Thank you. Well, you're not going to take that, are you? Yes, sir.
Finalist principle. There's
Trouble with principle.
trouble with principle. Why limit it to speech? I mean, since law itself is based, at least in our system, on principle, at least in some sense.
Is it? Yeah, right.
Well, for our students who study black letter law and training for exam, we believe it, they operate on that premise. It would seem that under your system, it's the old debate between Aristotle and Plato. For Plato, it's just get your good men and let them decide with the right ideas, rather than have principled laws. So why not extend this and so that we have no laws, we just have commissions of good people who decide cases on facts?
Well, of course, although I certainly agree with your characterization of this as an ancient choice in just the terms that you put it, in the context of the law, the choice is complicated by the fact of a body of law. That is, the law can live either in a set of principles or in the precedents, the massive precedents, the common law that stands behind our present moment in history. And it is quite possible to articulate rules as rules of thumb. It is quite possible to speak in generalities without speaking in generalities with those orotund tones that sometimes accompany the rhetoric of principle, and to make decisions. It is not the case that in our system, or in any system that I know of, at least in the Western world, that a judge, be he good or bad, is free and unconstrained in his or her operations. Every branch of the law, as you all know better than I, has within it categories of organizations, rubrics. When you, as a lawyer, listen to the client who tells you a story, you are hearing that story with different ears than the ears that she hopes you may have. For her, the story takes a certain form, largely in relation to her personal sense of outrage, which is real and should not be dismissed. But what you're hearing is a story that can or cannot be fit into a number of categories ranging from 3 to 10,000 that are part of your knowledge of whatever branch of law it is that is appropriate. And that's, of course, your first task, to decide to hear this story as a tort story rather than a contract story. And then once you've made that larger designation within that, third-party beneficiary or unconscionability or whatever it might be. Now, you cannot tell me, or you could tell me, but I would disagree, get that all of these categories are categories of abstract principle. They are categories which have emerged in the course of the adjudication and arguing of particular cases. They are there. Not only are they there as resources for the lawyer, they are there as constraints on both the lawyer and the judge, because you must present your case to the court as a legal case, which means that you must show that your account of what this means can be fit under recognizable legal rubrics. And when the court, in the person of one judge or a multi-judge court, decides the court must couch its decision in the same terms, so that there are those constraints. Now, those constraints have been called by my many times debating partner, Ronald Dworkin, the weak constraints of practice. Dworkin wrote some very powerful essays early on. Not that he's not writing powerful essays now, but there are 2 or 3 essays that he wrote early on, which I think are, even when I disagreed with them, are extraordinarily incisive and provocative in the most fruitful way. And one was called The Forum of Principle. And in the end of that article, he says what we must do, and this is not an exact quote, but it's fairly close, is flee the precincts of everyday situations in which all we have are the weak constraints of practice for the forum of principle. Now, my response to that is complicated. The heart of my response, however, would be that the constraints of practice are not weak. They are not weak at all. In fact, they are the real constraints. They are the constraints that you could possibly internalize. And after having internalized them, you could use them to make your way within the legal landscape. The forum of principle, while it is a rhetorically powerful appeal, points, in my mind, to a country that does not exist. There is no forum of principle. There are no principles of the kind that are usually given the names fairness, merit, justice, equality, and so forth. All there are, and this is the word, this is the sentence of another law professor, Lawrence Alexander of the University of San Diego, all there are empty vessels waiting to be filled with substantives. That's not only the task, that's the honorable task. My recommendation always, by the way, I'm not saying jettison the rhetoric of principle. I'm saying recognize it for what it is, a rhetoric, something that is useful in many situations, but should not be allowed to cloud your thinking and others. And if you are in a situation where it is clear that the rhetoric of principle will be powerful, and therefore that you should employ it, make sure that before you employ the principle, you've filled it with the substantive views that you favor, so that when people assent to the principle, they'll really be assenting to your substantive views, which is what you want anyway, what everybody wants. That's not an accusation either. Yes, sir.
Dean, on your second page, you have the quote, "The Constitution is not a suicide pact."
Yeah.
And you quote Arthur Goldberg, incidentally, for many years. What do you think that Goldberg meant by that?
I think that he meant, of course, the same thing that I mean. That is, abstractions which rest on nothing but themselves are assumed to have behind them no purpose in relation to which they were first formulated. You can in fact go down that road, but if you go down that road, you will fall into certain confusions, which are for some people useful confusions. For example, you can decide that as I think the recent decisions in the Supreme Court have indicated, at least in a certain set of cases, you can decide that the Voting Rights Act is a violation of itself. A whole series of decisions in Georgia, North Carolina, and other cases have said, in effect, hey, this redistricting plan, one which is very close to my former residence in North Carolina, this redistricting plan must be rejected because it is infected with race consciousness. To which I reply, yeah, race consciousness is why there was a Voting Rights Act in the first place. If you're going to enact a piece of legislation which emerges from history and then try to read it in a way that abstracts it from all possible histories, you're doing something very curious. Actually, you're doing something that is A, impossible, but B, is crafty, and is crafty for certain agendas. I've written a lot about the way in which what I call the vocabulary of principle, the vocabulary of words like merit, freedom, equality, most of all fairness, my least favorite word, but all of the others are pretty much in. I've written the way in which these words, which were the property, they thought, of certain kinds of liberal progressives in this country in the 40s and 50s and 60s, have been successfully appropriated by their ideological opponents. And that liberals, being the general group of saps that they are, haven't quite recognized this and are continually being hit over the head by their own favorite words and haven't recognized yet that they've now been filled with another content, and one that they would reject if they could only open up their eyes and see it. Now, in saying this, by the way, in giving this advice to liberals, hey, you guys don't know what you're doing, I am not saying that I want them to wake up, because in general, my views are all on the conservative side. But that's a whole other story. Oh, but I will say this, because I want to, if I can, confound you further. Those of you who have graciously listened to what I have said today, I guarantee you, could not, from what I have said today, determine what my substantive views on anything are. Because you might have noted, or noted by absence, that I had never declared any. Yeah.
You segue right into my question.
Oh, good.
To go back to the beginning. As a college dean, you certainly fall within that described group of imperfect individuals,
Right.
Who are assigned the job of evaluation.
You could have put it another way.
Assume you have a modern history professor at UIC who is teaching that, of course, 6 million Jews died, 5.5 million of them from the intolerable cholera condition, and perhaps 500,000 were gassed. What
Those other 500,000 was faulty piping.
What responsibility did you as dean have to curtail, correct, prohibit that speech?
Well, first of all, my first responsibility as dean would be to see that that guy never got hired. And if anyone came to me with,
Too late. He's there.
too late, he's there. Well, it depends on what he's hired for. That is, if he's hired because if a history department hired him to teach that stuff, I would look into ways of eliminating the history department, and I'm not kidding. Any department that acted that stupidly is by definition a candidate for elimination. Okay? Now, if it wasn't the case, if he was hired instead to teach X or Y, European history, American history, public policy, and he's teaching this stuff, then you get him for not teaching what he was hired to teach, period. Just as Wisconsin, the University of Wisconsin recently, as some of you will have read, altered the speech code, largely because the first one was declared unconstitutional, so it's a good idea. But they've come up with a new speech code. Instead of talking about words and pictorial representations that are offensive and demeaning to certain enumerated groups, they now talk about the necessity to protect all speech that is germane to the instructional program of a college. Now, that, of course, I don't know if this will pass muster with this particular court or not. I'm as good or bad as the rest of you in predicting the actions of the court. But it has the advantage of going from a standard of offensiveness, which is, of course, notoriously variable and historically unstable and open to all kinds of hypotheticals and counter arguments, to a standard, and this is the word, these are the words of the Wisconsin Code, standard of germane to the legitimate instructional mission of the university. And I think that under a code like that, or if you don't have a code like that, under an understanding like that, you could move against such a person. You would have to say to such a person, look, if you go out, if you appear on TV and say these things in the context of some kind of talk show debate, that's your business. Or if you write a letter to your congressman, or even write an op-ed for the Tribune or the Sun-Times, that's your business. But teaching our students is our business. And although we give you wide latitude, one of the things we don't allow you to do is teach your personal hobby horses, whether or not we agree with them. So I would go that direction. But I would not walk lightly around that one. Because once you do, there's no way in which you can begin to act in ways that strengthen the senses of responsibility on your campus. And those senses of responsibility are crucial. I gave an interview. I don't know whether they will show it, and if they show it, what they will show. But this morning I was interviewed by the Today program on just this question, the one that relevant to the question that you raised. And I said that, and one of the questions asked me by the interviewer was, well, why are there speech codes? I mean, when did they come up? Why has that been so much a feature of the last 15 or 20 years? Well, that's a complicated question, which deserves a complicated answer, but you don't give complicated answers to the Today program. So I said, but I believe in the answer that I did give in general, which is that to a certain point, decorums of speech and behavior appropriate to college and university settings were assumed. Nobody ever thought that when I was an undergraduate, back in the 50s, nobody ever thought that it was even a question as whether you could say this or that in a class or speak to persons either inside or outside the class on a campus in certain ways. It wasn't a question. You would be hauled up before the dean of students and various disciplinary measures would be forthcoming. Now, that general set of decorums and sense of decorums has been replaced not only in university life but elsewhere with what I think of as the culture of libertarianism. My other name for libertarianism, by the way, is insanity. So you see where it is that I stand on those questions. And under the culture of libertarianism, the first thing that you protect, and which trumps all values, is the ability to do and say anything you like. Once that's the reigning ethic, or at least a strong ethic on a campus, then you begin to think, well, maybe we should have a speech code. Actually, and I've said this in print, I don't think speech codes are a good idea. I don't have a moral objection to them. I have a practical objection to them. They don't do the job. They cause more trouble than they are worth. And usually they act as a red flag to persons who wish to prove that they can withstand any such petty enforcement of conformity, etc., etc. So speech codes are not a good idea because they won't work. If they did work, they would be a dandy idea in my view. Is that enough confession? Thank you.